Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Data Projects. I'm Gunjan, and with me I have Neil Hepburn. Hi, Neil.
Hi, Gunjan.
Cheers.
Cheers.
How are you?
Doing well. The weather is beautiful outside. Summer is just starting up here. So, yeah, looking forward to going for a little walk after this.
Absolutely. That would be
Yeah.
a change from the last few months for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, it's nice.
Yeah. So, Neil, last time when we met, we talked about what are data projects and what are the risks that plague these data projects. So, one of the things that resonated with me the most was the fact that there's data gatekeeping,
Right.
which negatively impacts these projects. So I'm wondering if you can elaborate on that in this episode a bit more.
Absolutely. So, what before I get into data gatekeeping, I thought I'd just do a very quick recap of the last session, if
Absolutely.
that's okay. So, in the last session, we talked about what a data project is. And I define it as an IT business project that sort of involves both the business
Hmm.
and the IT. And it also has a bulk, or actually more to the point, historical
Right.
data aspect to it. Um, so that's the main project. And the risks that I listed, as you mentioned, are data gatekeeping, lack of data connoisseurship, and this what I call like a Tower of Babel
Hmm.
situation. People aren't really speaking the same language. So today I want to get into data gatekeeping, and I'm going to break it down in five different subtopics. So we're going to talk about what are the impacts of data gatekeeping,
Right.
um, what are the reasons that it happens, what are the consequences when it does actually happen,
Hmm.
and then I'm going to get into something a bit more prescriptive and give the viewer some general advice on how to approach data obtainment and
Right.
locating and obtaining data in these scenarios. And finally, I'm going to get a little bit more specific and talk about some common, what I call deflections from
Hmm.
data gatekeepers, sort of excuses why they can't give you the data
Yeah. So
and
how
how
to
you can deal with it.
recognize it, right?
Well, yeah, how to also recognize, we'll be talking about that a little bit earlier when we talk about the reasons, but
Okay.
there's sort of common, I would say, go-to excuses that you'll
Right.
often hear, and I'll give you some suggestions on how to do that. Now, to ground things, I thought, what we're seeing right now is we're here in Ontario, both of us, Ontario
Hmm.
for those who are maybe around the world. And as we all know, we're dealing with this COVID-19 issue and the
Hmm.
virus and all that. And there was actually an editorial in the Globe and Mail last weekend. It's a Canadian newspaper, um, where the editor in chief was essentially bringing up what the readers were complaining about. And she was
Right.
saying, I think her name's Sylvia Stead, was complaining that there's not enough access to data, and
Hmm.
that too many Ontarians just feel like they're in the dark.
Right.
And so a lot of the dynamics that I'm going to get into today are sort of reflected in that scenario. So I'll try to kind of ground it a little bit
Sure.
in that. I'll also mention a movie that you can watch. I think it's on Amazon Prime called Report, starring Adam Driver,
Hmm.
and it's an entire movie about data gatekeeping.
Wow.
So it's about somebody's trying to put together a report and trying to get information and all of these struggles. And I won't go into the details, but you can look into it if you're curious.
Yeah,
So
I'll definitely make a note of that on the weekend to catch up.
yeah. It's a very good movie actually. So what is data gatekeeping exactly? What does it impact? So data gatekeeping is when you need data for a project. You know it's kind of out there in a vague sense, or you might even know it's out there in a specific sense, but you just can't seem to get it for whatever reason.
Right.
So this impacts your ability to find the data to begin with,
Right.
and it also impacts your ability to obtain the data in a manual sense, because usually you'll just get a manual data extract, and of
Hmm.
course it impacts your ability to automate data
Right.
extraction, and all of this together really just impacts the overall project. It's
Yeah.
a
I think it's basically inhibiting collaboration and the next steps in the innovation, right? Simply.
correct, yeah.
Yeah.
So there's kind of three main reasons. Now I want to get into the reasons for this. So there's three main reasons that I see, at least. And by the way, all of this, it's just based on my experience. So I'm not citing any book or anything like that. I mean, I have my experience. I spend a lot
Hmm.
of time seeing this. So I'm just showing that these are the patterns that I've seen.
Right.
So the first reason is the most obvious, which is what I call the normal, transparent reason. So, using the example of the Ontario COVID, the government would say something like, we have these privacy rules. We can't just
Mhm.
throw out the data as we please.
Right.
We also have processes that we need to follow. So those are what I call like above board reasons. They're fairly transparent. If that's the only reason, then that's not necessarily a bad situation, because a lot of the time, gatekeeping is there for a reason. And I just want to be clear, by the way, I'm not an anarchist. I believe that we need to have some kind of rules to get along, and data gatekeeping is part of that.
Right.
And most of the time, it's actually done for the right reasons. So that's the first reason, is just you have normal rules. Um, when you go and you ask for data, you need to have approvals, you need to be authorized, and that can just slow things down, and you might have to fill forms out.
Yeah, so it's just checks and balances in place,
Yeah,
right, to ensure there's no negative use coming out of or impact coming out of that data access.
right. And if that was the only reason for data gatekeeping, I wouldn't be recording this video with you right now.
Right.
There are a couple other reasons that it happens. So the second reason is the data owner might have different motivations. There might be some goal congruence issues between the owner of the data, or who's responsible for it, and the enterprise.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
what I mean by that, to sort of break that down a little bit, that usually that as well is for fairly innocent reasons, but it can really bog things down because the person is not always forthright
Right.
that what's going on. So I'll give you a very common thing that you'll see, which is the person that's providing the data is often doing things that most other people would not be aware of, maybe cleaning it up, or
Hmm.
preparing it manually, or making little adjustments here and there.
Right.
And they're
So,
probably doing that. Sorry?
yeah, sorry, I was going to say that's more like hidden business rules almost, right? That are not shared with everybody. So it's a set of activities that are not known.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. And this situation is not uncommon.
Hmm.
And again, most people, like I said, will usually just sort of be upfront and say, "Hey, like here's the data, but I got to tell you, like
Right.
I had to do this or that, or it might not reconcile over here because of these reasons."
Yep.
So hopefully that's what happens. But sometimes a person won't really even just say that, and they'll start
Yeah.
to put up smoke screens for why you can't get the data. So that's the second reason. And the third reason is what I call, and this is the most actually, so the second reason is interesting, and that if you watch that movie, the report I just mentioned to you, it's all about that.
Ah, okay.
And the real and what is kind of in the movie, what comes through in the movie and what comes through in real life is, at some level, the data owner is fearing some kind of accountability or embarrassment.
Hmm.
Feels that by revealing the data, they're kind of revealing something of themselves,
Right.
and so that's why they don't want to hand it over.
So it's like a loss of control or loss of, maybe sometimes if the data could be used for automation purposes, then loss of job even, right?
Yes, yeah. I mean, I even heard about one organization that had three sets of books in their
Mm.
finance. They had
Oh,
a public set, they had an internal set, and they had a private set. And so the public set would go out to the general public, the finances. The
right.
internal set would go out to certain other departments in this organization. And there was a final private set that never got beyond two or three people.
Wow, that's interesting. I've heard of two sets of books. I've never heard of three, so this is the first one for me.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I won't obviously protect
That's okay.
the trophy.
Story for another day when you're having coffee privately.
Yeah. And then the third reason, and this is the reason actually. So by the way, the second reason, just to
Mhm.
tie that off, is it's interesting, it's fascinating. Again, you can make movies about that, but at the same time, it's hard to find. It's about human nature itself,
Right,
and so for someone like me, there's not much I can do about that.
right,
So that it is what it is. Those situations are all kind of unique in their own way, but the common denominator is this idea of being held to account, and maybe fearing embarrassment, or
right.
follow-up questions or something. So the third reason for data gatekeeping for me is the most interesting, because I think there's something that can be done about it, and I also think it's the main reason that data gatekeeping happens, even with this COVID situation.
Hmm.
And by the way, just in that last point, the COVID situation, there's a lot of speculation that this gatekeeping is because the government doesn't want to reveal disparity between
Right.
different demographics, right? And so that is, again, going back to that accountability embarrassment thing,
Right.
right? And I don't think that that's in dispute. So I don't think what I'm saying there is all that controversial.
Hmm.
The third reason, and again, I'll give you some examples in the government, is what I call, or what has been called, the database bureaucracy. You might call it a system fiefdom. There's usually some kind of a service layer where somebody, the data gatekeeper, can see everything. They're on one side of
Right.
the horizon,
Right.
and they have a kind of, there's information asymmetry, so they can see certain things that you can't. But there's
Right.
also often another factor where there's just so much complexity that even that data gatekeeper themselves doesn't even understand what's going on.
Right.
And so the reason for the database bureaucracy, and this is quite fascinating to me, it really comes back to kind of a three-legged stool in a way. And so the legs of the stool are, you have the vendor that makes a system. A system could be anything. It could be um, a Salesforce.com, let's say, like a
Right.
CRM management system. So you have a vendor like Salesforce.com. Then you'll have consultants who advise, and advisory consultants and system integration consultants who will maybe recommend and implement that system.
Hmm.
And then finally, you'll have like a custodian who operates the system um, within the company. Okay, so these three groups are working together for the success of the system. So in their
Right.
minds, they all want to succeed.
Right.
That's understandable. Where things can be problematic is sometimes they will see things as a zero-sum game,
Hmm.
meaning that they will often view the extraction of data out of that system as somehow or another undermining that system.
Right.
Meaning that, oh, if you take the data out and you put it somewhere else, then you don't really need us to manage the data anymore. Uh, we shouldn't be allowing, we should be asking why they want to do this kind of thing. So this dynamic is also exacerbated by the fact that basically everybody wants to have service layers to begin with,
Yeah.
right? So there's always this sort of desire, like, have to put it behind a service, put it behind a service. There's an old saying from a guy by the name of Fred Brooks. He wrote the Mythical Man Month, No Silver Bullet. He led the IBM OS 360 project back in the 1960s, which, if you've ever heard of the Mythical Man Month, it was the biggest IT
Hmm.
technology project at the time. And what he points out is, he says, if you show me your process diagrams and your workflows, I will be mystified. But
Right.
if you show me your data, I don't need to see your process diagrams or workflow.
Right.
So there's something, again, it kind of comes back to that accountability thing I was saying earlier about the data owner, but
Hmm.
it's sort of brought up a level.
Yeah.
And once you start to kind of, you have a kind of very large system that's very complicated, that where there's that service layer and you don't have access behind that, you get into this sort of almost like battle to figure out what's behind that horizon and
Hmm.
what can I get out of there.
Right.
And if the people inside that system are not on your side, like do not have your motivations in mind,
Yeah.
they can spin you around till the cows come home.
That's true.
And there's all sorts of things that they can do to prevent you from investigating that
Yeah.
system.
So
So,
that's quite interesting you say that because this is where it makes me think of the leadership and the culture together as well, right? Because even for the second point, I'm not sure if I forget which book this is from. There was a memo that, for example, Jeff Bezos had sent a long time ago within Amazon when people were doing exactly what you said, right? Not sharing data, not being forthright. So he sent out a one-page memo, very brief, saying, from now on, every organization, every department within the company will have an API. I don't care what technology you use or whatever it is, just expose an API to share everything you have to ensure
yeah.
transparency, right? So that apparently broke down some of those barriers because he ended that memo with, whoever doesn't do this will be fired. Thank you. Have a good day.
So that's both the right thing to do and very rare, and
Right.
might not even be as successful.
You think so? Yeah.
Um, so first of all, Jeff Bezos is a very technical CEO
Hmm.
and understands these things.
Right.
It's rare to see a run-of-the-mill CEO have that level of confidence
Agree.
in
Yeah.
something like that. Second thing is, I would actually challenge Jeff Bezos on that right now.
Mm.
And I bet you any money that I could go in, not I shouldn't say any money because that guy could destroy me,
I'll
but
take that bet.
$1 million, Neil, let's do it. No, I'm pretty confident that I could walk into Amazon tomorrow into their headquarters and find a lot of gatekeep databases that don't comply. And I'll tell you where
I'm
to look.
sure. I'm sure. However, I
Go
think
into
it
salaries
does.
right there. Just how much
That's
people
fair.
everybody make? Tell me. You said there's an API. Where's the API? Well, how
No,
much is
that's fair. That's fair, right? At the management level, that's completely fair. But I'm looking at it more from a point of view of projects, right? If you're developing products or projects, from that level, at least the leadership then supports that. The culture changes, maybe one step at a time.
Absolutely. No, it's absolutely the right thing. I'm not, all I'm saying is that it's very easy to evade.
Yeah.
But I'm going to point out another problem. Even if Jeff Bezos, everybody does what he's saying, I still have a problem with the way the world works right now,
Hmm.
because the problem with most data is it's in databases or it's behind
That's
some
true.
API. Okay. In my view, until data is converted into a document
Hmm.
that doesn't change, that is what it is,
So raw
like a
data.
contract, for example,
Okay.
right? Like you don't have with your bank a mortgage service API layer where you might query it every day, and maybe you stole money, maybe you don't. Who knows? The API is telling you what the truth is.
Right.
That situation is everywhere though. But you have a contract. It's a document. It doesn't move around from day to day.
Yeah.
And not to use too much of an obscure example, but when you query a database, you can run the same query 2 days in a row and get different results.
Hmm.
So by
That's true.
that, because you have things like late arriving data that comes in.
Right.
So what I'm trying to say is, it's like you have this kind of, I don't know if you've ever heard of Schrodinger's cat. It's this
Yeah.
quantum thought
Is it
experiment where,
alive or is it dead?
yeah, exactly. And I feel like that's what all this data is like in these databases. Like, is the cat alive? Is the cat dead? I feel like until the cat comes out in a document, we don't know.
It's
So this
fair.
is this is just a personal, again, observation that I've had in all this, and I have ideas around how to correct this. And I think ultimately the solution to all this is until we move to working in a way where all of the data to be deemed real has to be published in a document format along with the metadata. I think we're going to be struggling this for a very long time to come.
Right. So just to clarify, when you say document, you mean data in its raw format. Is that right?
Well, what raw format is to suggest there is some kind of natural format, but I would just say like
Hmm.
a CSV format,
Okay.
right? So if I can get data in an extracted CSV format,
But
and those,
untouched data, right? The data, the way that it exists, essentially is what you're saying,
yeah,
not touched
there's
or
no,
not fluffed.
correct. There's no distance between the data in the database
Right.
and what you have. But there's also metadata that I can use to validate that data
That's
is
fair.
correct and it is what it is. And again, I just kind of want to bring data back to what it's traditionally been before the invention of the database, which is documents. I mean, this is
Mhm.
how we've been managing information for at least 5,000 years. And now all of a sudden, the last few years, it's like, oh, we've got this sort of volatile Schrodinger's cat situation. Why? Because the technology has created that situation. But
That's fair.
notice that whenever you do any project, usually the first thing people say is, give me an extract.
Hmm.
Or
Hmm.
all of these big data warehouses, they're getting data through extracts. So the
Right.
irony is everything transit through documents anyway, but we always put the document as some second-class citizen and the database is the first-class citizen. It's all backwards.
Right.
So I don't want to get too much into that subtopic because I think that it is what it is. It's not going to change anytime soon. Sure, I have some big ideas, but those will take a while to materialize. I want to talk about the consequences
Right.
about what happens when you run into these situations and you get kind of rebuffed. So the best thing that can happen is you just delay the project until you get it. Okay,
Mm.
that's in my opinion the best move. Or maybe you even cancel the project.
So it's like taking a stand, right? To say, I'm either going to do this right or I'm not going to do it.
Exactly, and also to recognize that the data is critical to the
Right.
project success, and not pretend that you can paper over it.
Right. So it's a
Um,
prerequisite, not a afterthought.
Right. Now, the reality is, though, is when you get a project ramping up and there's a budget and there's project managers and people are hired, what I also observe is that there's this kind of momentum, that's this train that you just can't stop.
Right.
You're like, Neil, we're just moving ahead. And that's where you get into half measures. So I'm just going to talk about some of these half measures because there's a couple half measures that I see out there. So one half measure is people will get like a one-off extract. It might even
Mhm.
be not even real. So it'd be like semi-fictional, or it's like a one-off extract. That that's actually not necessarily a bad thing. If the data is real, it's okay. But sometimes you can kind of get set up for failure later on if the data is not automated. So if
Mhm.
all that was again something that somebody manually prepared in an Excel spreadsheet,
Right.
and that person needs to be there for the next data refresh, and you
Yeah.
haven't really thought about how to automate that, that can really stymie things down the road.
So when you say automated, you mean frequent extracts, but true extracts, not manipulated data.
Well, if yeah, exactly. I mean, if it's manipulated, then you've done it in a
Right.
way that's repeatable. Um, so I mean, it's very common actually that that a lot of the data that you get into other systems comes just from a user generated report,
Right.
like a PDF even.
Mhm.
And that's because there's all these business rules in the report itself to calculate those values, and that's the only place that data exists.
Right.
So often you'll see, and this is one of the reasons why so-called RPA, robotic process automation, has gone up a lot lately, is that people recognize that a lot of these systems are only automatable through user interactions.
Mhm. Mhm.
Another thing that I need to tell you, another real life story. I once saw a system. It was a retailer, and it was a special retail system where they could generate a report, even
Right.
in a CSV format. However, and this goes back to that sort of database bureaucracy I was telling you about earlier, the vendor was very clever and made you fill out what's called a CAPTCHA. And a CAPTCHA is
Mhm.
something that you might see on websites where it'll say, you know, there'll be some squiggly
Right.
letters, and it'll say type this
Confirm you're
in.
human type thing. Yeah.
Exactly, prove that you're human. And that's done specifically to prevent the automation because the
Mhm.
vendor doesn't, the
Right.
vendor has their own ideas. So that the workaround, so so sometimes you just have to figure out how am I going to take these user systems and use RPA or something similar. Sometimes it's just telling somebody, hey, your job is to run this report and save it in this folder every month.
Right.
Or that's one of your things you need to do. I mean, it wouldn't be a full-time job, obviously. It's one of the things you have to do,
Right.
and that's what a lot of people do. So that's one half measure, and that's not so bad if you're there. But the second half measure is where you are using an alternate or fictional data set that's not actually the real one that you need. And this is really problematic once you go down this road. This is
Mhm.
where you're really skating on thin ice. This is problematic for three reasons. First of all, data projects need feedback based on the data,
Mhm.
not on the superficial aspects of the user experience of the report.
Right.
The more significant feedback has to be on the underlying insights of the data, because that drives questions and follow-up questions, and that drives requirements. So you lose all of that when it's not real data. Everybody just checks out mentally.
Right.
Um, the other thing that can happen is that if you use an alternate data set, you'll often people will just take data that's easily available, and build things around that. And
Mhm.
there's a joke actually in data management that I'll just tell very quickly that sort of summarize that kind of explains that. So the joke is this: there's a woman walking home late at night, and she notices there's a man on all fours circling around a lamppost.
Mhm.
And she looks over and sees the man is clearly lost something, and he looks a little bit drunk at the same time. And so he says, "Excuse me, sir, are you looking for something?" And the man looks up, and he's clearly had too much to drink. And he says, "Yeah, I'm looking for my keys."
Mhm.
And the woman says, "Did you drop them right here then?" He says, "I have no idea, but the light's great here."
Nice.
Right. So this joke is so helpful because that's what I see a lot.
Yeah.
And I see people will circle that lamppost, um, because that's where the light is. That's where the data is. And often
Yeah.
you'll just hear insights based around what was at hand as opposed to what was
Right.
needed. So that can, when you fall down that trap, it's hard to sometimes revector.
Right.
The third thing that can happen is because you're not dealing with the real data and you can't get that feedback, people are doing what's known as bike shedding. And
Mm-hmm.
so you can look this up on Wikipedia. It's also called Parkinson's law of triviality.
Mm-hmm.
I might explain it actually in our next video around data connoisseurship. But just to explain what happens is when the people that are supposed to give the feedback aren't able to give feedback about the data,
Right.
they'll look at other things. They'll spend time on things like the color scheme, the fonts, the number formatting, the layout. And that's all well and good. That's all important to have a nice presentation, but it can suck up all the time. And then you get to the end of the project and you have something that looks beautiful, and then the answers it's spitting out are either completely useless or wrong. And so that unfortunately,
Yeah.
again, because the train has left the station in terms of the project, I'm going to get this project done. We're going to have people
Right.
working on it. Everybody's going to pat themselves on the back when it's
Yeah.
done.
You're too invested into getting it done as opposed to doing it right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and when I say, like, risk of failure, like, to be clear, I've never heard anybody say out loud, "Well, that failed. This project was a failure." It's always just, "Well, yeah, people aren't using it as much as we expected, and we're thinking about this other thing." And so you only really know about failure 3 years,
Right.
looking back. Can you really say something succeeded or
Yeah.
failed? So on that note, I want to get into some suggestions on how to
Mm-hmm.
work with data gatekeeping. So I've been a little bit negative so far, but I want to try to give you some more positive. So the first suggestion is be patient and work through existing processes when possible, and don't spin people up until you've exhausted other routes.
Right.
So if somebody is not giving you something, don't assume the worst of that person. Just assume that this person is acting in good faith until you have reason not to, and
Right.
specific reason not to. And usually, like I said, most of the data gatekeeping is in good faith. It is for the right reasons. So try to figure what that process is.
Right.
Try to follow that process.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's about recognizing what assumptions and constraints that person is under to
Right.
see how you can help them get over that.
Correct. So the second thing that you can do when dealing with data gatekeeping is to be as transparent yourself about what you want to do with the data, and also in your general dealings with the data gatekeeper,
Mm-hmm.
because you want to set an example in a way.
Right.
Because if it does come to the point of a confrontation, you want to be the person that's transparent.
Right.
Um, Thirdly, and again, all of this is before you start spinning people up, um, you should document and articulate the consequences for not getting the data.
Right.
So that way, if you do get if they are saying, okay, you're not going to get it, then you can tell that person, okay,
Yeah.
if I don't get the data, then this project is going to be delayed. It's going to escalate to this person, and they're probably going to want to talk. Somebody's going to want to talk to you at some point.
Yeah.
So I don't have a problem. Everybody has a job to do, but I think that this is the chain reaction this will set off.
Right. So
But
consequences
again,
for
not in a
that.
passive aggressive way. Sorry.
Yeah. No, I was going to say consequences for that individual, but at the same time, calling out why the data is important for the project success as well, right? To say, here's why this is the basis for what we do from here on. And here's what
Yeah.
happens to you specifically or to other people if
Right.
it's not done right.
Right. And and just like not in a passive aggressive way,
Yeah.
but in a very, again, just
Yeah.
good faith. I
Factual
understand
way. Yeah.
yeah, like you're busy, you can't do this right now, or this has to happen, and that's fine. But if I don't get this, then this is going to happen instead.
Exactly. Yeah. And being
So
very clear about it, right? Not beating around the bush, as a
yeah,
lot of people tend to do.
yeah. And then fourthly, sometimes what can happen is people will go right after what I'd call like an automated or raw data feed. So
Hmm.
that sometimes, in my view, is it's good to do that, like in terms of preparing for success. Like I said earlier, if you can
Yeah.
only get a manual feed, then you're not going to go anywhere. But often the only option you have is manual to begin with.
Right.
So if that's what it is, or you don't know what the automated options are, just get the manual and move
Yeah.
forward and figure out how to automate that later. So
Right.
don't try to win every battle, just try to get the manual data and then move on from there.
Yeah.
um, Now, I want to finally, just to finish this video off, I want to talk about some common deflections that I'll see. And
Yes.
again, this speaks more to the database bureaucracy. So when it comes to the person who's got these other
Yeah.
motivations, there's no general advice I can give you there. But I can give you a general advice in terms of the database bureaucracy, because these are patterns that I see with all of these system fiefdoms, whether it's a
Right.
Salesforce.com or Oracle, SAP, Microsoft, you name it. They all seem to follow these patterns. And all the people, the custodians and whatnot, seem to follow them when you ask for data. So
Hmm.
the first common deflection is they'll say, well, what do you want to accomplish?
Right.
Maybe we can build that for you. And
Hmm.
usually, so my response to that deflection will be to say, what we're trying to do is cross-system reporting, so your stuff and other systems. So we need the data in a neutral environment,
Right.
so that both parties, because both parties, there's another Salesforce.com, let's say it's, I don't know, Workday or Sales, ServiceNow or Oracle, they also have the same opinion.
Yeah.
So, I'm just trying to get things in a neutral place.
Right.
So that's why it doesn't make sense for you,
Yeah.
Mrs. Salesforce.com, to do this for me. So
Which is in
that's how you can deal.
clients' best interest as well, right? It's usually in clients' best interest to have access to that data so they can make proper decisions to begin with.
Right.
Right.
And so there's a kind of a second deflection that's very closely related to the first one, where they'll say, okay, you know what, why don't you just give us the data and we'll build a report for you. And again, the answer is, well, we think it's important to have it in a kind of a neutral place, because Salesforce.com, I know you have lots of reporting functionality, but it's not really inherently a reporting platform, is it? It's really more of a
Right.
CRM platform. Um, and we have other tools like Tableau and Power BI and Click that are inherently good at that. So maybe it makes more sense to put an inherent reporting environment as opposed
Right.
to an inherent CRM. What do you think about that? That's one thing that you can say. The other thing is that if you were to go along with that plan of saying, okay, here, we'll put the data into your world, that world is not as transparent.
Right.
And so if people want to be able to explore different questions and do what if analysis and maybe machine learning or whatever the case, it doesn't even have to be that far, because just more exploratory type of analysis, then they're not going to be want to throw the requirements over a wall and wait
Right.
for an answer 2 days later. They want to bring the data into, again, a secure workspace where
Right.
they can explore and experiment with the data as they please. And those systems like Salesforce or Oracle or SAP are not conducive to that type of exploration, because that's not what they're inherently built to do.
Hmm.
So the third one, which is the most fun, and by the way, those first two, you usually can convince the person to give you the data, or at least consider giving you the data. The
Right.
third one is where people will really play games, and this is where I don't have time to get into some of the details, but um, you can, it's essentially a game. So what will happen is the person will kind of go, well, you want some data out of my Salesforce.com. What do you want? What is the data you want? Tell me
Right.
exactly. What are you looking for?
Right.
And now you're like, well, I don't know. What is there? And they're like, there's data. There's oh yeah, PeopleSoft. Do you know there's like over 1 million tables in PeopleSoft? Did you know that? What table do you want? And there's another 50 million data elements. Which of these 50 data elements do you want? Which
Right.
of these 50 million tables? Oh,
So it's the chicken and the egg, right? You don't, I won't show you what I have, but I need you to know.
right, right. And so
Right.
that's where, it's helpful to have somebody that has experience in these situations.
Right.
I mean, this is something that I do quite a bit. And I can tell you all sorts of stories. But the normal thing I'll do is I will try to figure out if there's some business reports out there already that are getting data from this
Hmm.
system. And if that has kind of the data that I'm looking for, because again, people have this vague notion that data is out there, and they might be able to track down a report that has that data that came from that
Yeah.
system. So then what I'll try to do is I'll try to get a copy of that report and I'll say, hey, where did this data come from in this report here? So that's one thing I'll try to do. I think before that actually is, if you can get that person on your side, then that's the best situation really.
Hmm.
And maybe that means putting them into your project and giving
Right.
them budget, right? And just saying, we're going to pay this guy's on our payroll
Right.
now. And that's another really smart thing to do in that situation. But often they don't have the budget to do that. So again, you can take these reports and say, hey, where did the data come from? And maybe kind of work backwards from there. A last resort that I'll do with databases, I'll ask for what's known as the information schema. And this
Right.
is really just a table that tells you with all the columns and all the tables and the primary key and foreign key constraints. And you can sometimes figure certain things out there. But as I mentioned a moment ago, PeopleSoft has over 1 million tables in this system. So I've had that before where people say, "Oh, you want the data dictionary? Here you go," and you're combing through tens of thousands of data elements. And even nominal systems can have thousands of data elements, and often they'll use you'll have databases that have what are known as key value pairs.
Right.
So the data elements themselves are just encoded in the data. You can't even see them in the schemas. So like, again, if somebody wants to spin you around and you have a big enough database, you can spin people around real good. So there is no silver bullet for that last
Yeah.